With allegations of a cover-up and obstruction of justice circulating in Washington, Americans in 2017 are looking to the presidency of Richard Nixon for precedent and understanding. Today's guest literally wrote the book on Nixon's life after his own career covering politics in Washington. He's John Farrell, this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University in beautiful Newport, Rhode Island. Alongside me is my co-host G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. If you join us regularly, you know each week we try to understand the narratives that shape our understanding of public life. This week we're joined by John Farrell, an accomplished journalist and author who has covered American politics for nearly 5 decades. Did I get that right? 5 decades?
Yeah, you're making me feel old.
Yeah, his new book, Richard Nixon, The Life, was published in March to critical acclaim. John, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
The book did receive wide critical acclaim when it launched. The Washington Post calls it the best one-volume cradle-to-grave biography that we could expect about the life of Richard Nixon. What drew you to Nixon?
Well, for the one thing, there is about 66% of the American population who are either not alive or not living in this country when Richard Nixon resigned. So there's a big audience of people out there who know him only from The Simpsons or from the Hollywood movie where the robbers are about to go into the bank and they pull on a rubber mask and all the baby boomers in the audience laugh because they know it's Nixon, and the rest of them sort of scratch their heads. So there was a big opening there to tell people Richard Nixon's story for the first time. And since the turn of the century, there has been this flood of new information. All the tapes came out, files, 400 oral histories from his childhood friends and family that I was the first to be able to tackle. So there was a bunch of forces came together, and then, of course, the cherry on top was that the book comes out with no planning whatsoever with the Trump administration, and you have this incredible series of similarities between the Nixon administration and Watergate and the Trump administration and this Russia thing.
Well, we're going to want to talk about that
sure.
in the moments ahead. But on the book first, so it's a great Father's Day gift. We should note that. But what intrigued
God
you?
God bless you.
What a gift for any day, for that matter.
Congratulations.
It's a great book.
What did you discover that people who are maybe familiar with the Nixon presidency, that's new?
Yeah, I think the most noteworthy finding of the book was that in the 1968 presidential campaign, which we're coming up in the 50th year anniversary next year, Nixon sent a envoy to the South Vietnamese and told them to drag their feet and not participate in Lyndon Johnson's peace plan, because that would help Nixon get elected if the thing was to fall apart at the last minute. And indeed, it did. And Lyndon Johnson was eavesdropping, or the FBI was eavesdropping on the South Vietnamese embassy, so they had the proof. They heard this envoy say, "Go slow, go slow." What we never knew was whether this was something spontaneous from the Nixon campaign or whether it was directed by Richard Nixon himself. And in this flood of new material were Bob Haldeman's political files. He was Nixon's chief of staff, and in them were these yellow legal pads of notes. And I was able to put for the first time the words, tell the South Vietnamese to go slow, anything we can do to monkey wrench it, into Nixon's mouth. So that's the historical contribution. Then there's just this is going to sound like bragging, but it's not. There's dozens of tiny little fresh new details, smaller than that one, but only because the Nixon Library has opened up its vaults and there has been so much more stuff for somebody like me to go through.
So how much time did you spend at the Nixon Library?
I probably went out there for a total of maybe 3 or 4 months, not in one stretch, but in different steps. It was funny because I would stay at the extended stay motel in Yorba Linda to save money, And so extended stay motels are like where rock band roadies stay or construction crews. And in Orange County, it's where they use it for overflow for the homeless people. And then Disneyland's nearby, so you get like the young people who are starring as characters for the summer. So breakfast was like the Star Wars cantina scene.
I think that's another book for you. That's colorful.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning the timing could not have been more perfect. I mean, your publisher must have loved you when Trump was elected. So it's uncanny timing, obviously it wasn't intentional, but let's get more substantial here. What are the parallels between this new president of ours and this former president of ours, Richard Nixon?
Well, you have to divide it up. Personally, background-wise, some similarities in their sort of grandiosity. Trump's tweets sometimes sound like Nixon's tapes, but different, very, very different backgrounds. Nixon came from a Dickensian background in Yorba Linda, which was not like it is today with beautiful cul-de-sacs and boulevards. In those days, there's a picture in the book, it looks like the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma. His father was an abusive, at least an emotionally abusive man. His mother was very cold, and as Richard Nixon famously said, never once in my life did she tell me that she loved me. So that's the kind of background he came from. He had two brothers die in his youth, and ruining the family's finances so that he couldn't go back east to the Ivy League to college. So you had this building resentment. It also gave Nixon, however, a leg up among other politicians in that he could see it in his audiences, and he could reach out and tap it because he experienced that grievance and resentment himself. And Trump had a little bit of that. We saw that last year when he was campaigning. The second thing you have to look at is the scandals, and the scandals are eerily reminiscent. The most recent one is allegedly using the intelligence agencies to call off the FBI. Well, that was the subject of what was called the smoking gun, which eventually caused Nixon to resign from office. Nixon had Haldeman call in the CIA director and tell him to tell the FBI to back off, that you're getting into national security. And in the case of the Trump administration, according to the reporting from Washington, you have them using the intelligence agencies to tell this FBI to back off. It's quite eerie. Firing of, they had its own little mini Saturday Night Massacre, the firing of FBI Director Comey. You have Donald Trump spontaneously talking about tapes. You have the word impeachment being brought up on the House floor. And this is all in the first 120 days of the Nixon administration. Of the Trump administration. It took 6 years in the Nixon administration.
Well, I keep going back and forth in my own head. Is this criminal or is this incompetent?
Well, it could be absolutely nothing. It could just be Trump being Trump. The thing about Nixon at the Saturday Night Massacre is that we had had 6 months of hearings in the Senate. We knew there were tapes. We knew why Nixon, theoretically, we knew why Nixon didn't want to turn over the tapes. So when that happened, it really looked like somebody was trying to slip the noose. But in Trump's case, we don't know what the crime is yet. I mean, we know that there's allegations that the Russians broke into the DNC and spread this disarray throughout our election. But as far as who in the administration might have talked to them or have helped them or colluded with them, we know zero. So it's the similarities are there in how the administration has dealt with it. But as you say, this could just be incredible incompetence. It might not be any illegality at all. Yeah.
I'm guessing you, better than anyone, or as well certainly as anyone, could get inside the head of Richard Nixon. I'm always interested in the psychology that underpins people and how they react to the world, in political world and in any world. So putting the politics aside during those years of Watergate, what was going on in his mind? Was he trying to save his honor? Was he trying to preserve his legacy? Was he stubborn? Had he been brought up under these bad circumstances and he figured, I'll just wait it out, I can survive this too? Or what was going on, do you think?
The original title of the book was Richard Nixon, An American Tragedy, because, and this is not unique to me, this is something that Henry Kissinger wrote in his diaries at the time, Elliot Richardson commented on, is that the arc of Nixon's life, the narrative, the story in the public square of Richard Nixon, is this very gifted man who has this classic flaw, And it's like a Greek tragedy, Elliot Richardson said, and it's like a Shakespearean tragedy, said Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger compared him to Hamlet in his eulogy at Nixon's funeral. And basically it was coming from this love-starved background, this hard knocks background. He always approached life as a underdog, seeing enemies everywhere, working on his paranoia. He was filled with self-loathing because he didn't get that kind of emotional feedback from his mother. One more Shakespearean analysis: he was Iago to his own Othello, whispering in his own ear, doubts. You're not worth it. And so when he gets into the presidency, and you've got Vietnam, you've got 30,000 nuclear weapons pointed around the world. You've got these great big goals that you're trying to achieve, like China and the Soviet Union, and somebody like Daniel Ellsberg leaks the Pentagon Papers. It's a small thing in the scope of things, but Nixon just would react totally out of scope. He'd go crazy, and he would launch into these anti-Semitic rants, and then he decided that he was going to bring in this group of guys, these thugs, to fight leaks, and call them the plumbers and have them operate out of the White House. And they bungled their first job, and so they're classic Washington. They were promoted over to the committee to re-elect, and they ended up getting caught in the Watergate. It really is a sad story.
How does I'm of that generation. I was alive when Nixon left office, but I have a lapel pin that someone gave me once that said "Too young to hate Nixon," and but Nixon has a role. He's almost a character in popular culture now.
Yeah.
What role does he play, and what purpose do you think that serves?
Well, politically, he was sort of passed by the Republican Party because they very quickly moved to Reaganism and started the Republican Revolution that has brought them so much success. He did play a major role in what was called the Southern Strategy, which started all the way back with Eisenhower, then came to fruition with Nixon and was cashed in on by Reagan. But for the most part, the Republicans sort of disowned him, so he sort of floats up there in the celestial heavens of politics by himself. The liberals will never embrace him, although he's starting to look better to them now as the passions of Vietnam and Watergate recede, and we spend time talking about the amazing list of accomplishments. China, SALT Treaty, the EPA, OSHA, Social Security cost of living raises. The list goes on and on.
So you have been, in your distinguished career, you've been an author, you've been a Washington correspondent, Washington editor, Washington bureau chief, you've been on the Boston Globe Spotlight team. You've certainly had an inside seat to see how American government operates. And so this is kind of a big question, and maybe you can give us a shorter answer, because otherwise we could spend the whole time on this. What have you learned from that inside seat about how American government operates?
The squeaky wheel gets the grease. And whether it's the squeaky wheel of money or the squeaky wheel of anger, region is very important, especially when you're talking about Congress. Regional interests are very important. And the biggest trend I've seen is we used to do these analysis of Congress, and there's always 12 Republicans to the left of center and 12 Democrats from the south to the right of center. Now you draw that line down the center, and there's none. There's a zero on either side. The parties are so polarized. And that's the biggest trend. It's also probably the biggest frightening thing that I've seen in
no Lowell Weickers, no David Borans, nobody who sort of crosses that divide.
Exactly, yeah.
We need to take a quick moment for station identification. This is Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. An audio version of this program airs 4 times every weekend on Sirius XM Satellite Radio's popular Politics of the United States, the POTUS Channel 124. We're produced in Providence, Rhode Island by a talented crew of professionals at Rhode Island PBS. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at JMLudis. My co-host, G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. He's an award-winning journalist in that. In fact, he just picked up his latest last week. You can follow him on Twitter at G. Wayne Miller. And our guest this week, the author of Richard Nixon, The Life, is John Aloysius Farrell. I'm using your formal name because you can follow him at Twitter at @JAloysius. That's JALOYSIUS. Did I get that right?
You did.
I'm
Very
impressed. You've had a remarkable career as a journalist, as a student of American politics. One of the buzzwords that has come to dominate coverage and discussion in the last 6 months is fake news.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what your take is on it, because lies are not new to American politics, but fake news, is that something new, and how do we address it?
I think fake news is different in that there used to be, back in Nixon's time, 3 networks, 2 wire services, and 5 or 6 big major newspapers. And if they were all part of sort of a guild, you know this, when you were brought up by crusty city editors who told you to get it right, get the other side, make sure that you're fair.
And make sure you go to the bar after a deadline.
That was the fun, that was the fun part.
I go way back to our beginnings,
But today, there's so many voices that can just jump in there, and you have foreign voices who can just jump in and create a website and make up stuff and have it flash through the internet. There was this astonishing Pizzagate story in Washington, D.C., where this guy from North Carolina traveled to Washington, D.C. with a rifle because he believed the fake news story that this pizza restaurant was hiding a child smuggling, child prostitution ring being run by Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's that kind of absurdities that catch on. Fox News is in the middle of one right now about this poor guy from the DNC who was killed in a street robbery, and they're saying that he's the one who leaked the. I don't even want to say it, but they brought up
and you see that all over social media. I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, that thing spreads like wildfire.
Now, the good thing about it is that this has caused, I think, the old mainstream media to become much more aggressive, to summon their fortitude and not lapse into that themselves. And right now at the Times and the Post, you have really good journalism being practiced.
When I worked in Washington, sometimes I thought that the press would report allegation because they didn't want to get scooped. So if someone was saying something on the floor of the House or Senate or in the midst of a presidential campaign, you report the allegation and then you let the reporting catch up.
Yeah.
Is that still... Has that changed in this environment?
There's a danger of that, but it doesn't actually appear in the pages of the newspaper because the daily newspaper is now so ancient by the time it actually lands on the doorstep. But you do find that somebody will say something, and it sounds like a great story on Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then all the reporters in town are tweeting about it. They're commenting on it. They're saying, "Did you hear about this?" And it becomes like this little frenzy on Twitter, and then you find out 12 hours later when the reporters have done their jobs that it wasn't that big a deal afterwards, or this is something that we already knew, or this is spin. And so you do, it's much more a function of, the frenzy is much more a function of social media these days than it is of the press.
You said, and I'm using my term, the silver lining is that newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post have really beefed up their reporting. They've gone places they maybe have not done before. The Washington Post just got off a hiring binge where they hired many, many people. What else beyond supporting that kind of journalism can people do to be better informed, to sort of put up a wall against the fake news? And internally, what can media do not to create that kind of frenzy that you talk about? Because I see it frequently where I work. And people, they get excited in social media. It's an instant gratification thing. Boom, tweet it, boom, 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 off it goes.
For what consolation it offers. When the Washington Post was doing Watergate, when Woodward and Bernstein were poking away at the Watergate cover-up, they were very careful. If you've seen the movie All the President's Men, you had to get 2 sources. Go get another source, Woodstein. I mean, they tried to do it well. The following spring, when Watergate breaks, and Judge John Sirica takes the burglars in and said, "You're all going to jail for 40 years unless you tell me what's happening." And then one of them breaks, and the story comes out. Howard Simons, the managing editor of the Washington Post, said it was like the entire press corps now was rushing in like sharks to the bloated carcass of a whale and ripping off mouthfuls and swallowing them without digesting them. And that is the danger, is that in a frenzy like this, back then and now, you can get this sort of race. And the other thing that amazes me as an old guy is that there's this impatience with the story being played out on Twitter. You want to get to the end much faster so you can get on to the next story. And I have to tell people, I said, Nixon was in office for 6 years. And this is going to take a long time. The FBI works very slow. The original bugging on this story happened 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen an indictment yet. So these things work really slow.
The universe has shifted, though. If you look at young people, and not just young people, it's that instant gratification, want to get the next thing, the next tweet.
That's the phrase I was
next
looking
YouTube
for.
thing, the next Instagram. I like Instagram.
But that being said, the pace of events here is staggering.
Absolutely.
It is. I mean, in 1 week we had, or maybe a little bit over 1 week, we had the firing of the FBI director. We had the word tape being introduced by Donald Trump. We had a special prosecutor named. We had the use of the word witch hunt by the president, which was a quote from Richard Nixon. And then we had almost a confession of Trump telling the Russians, if this is true, that boy, that took a lot of pressure off of me when I fired Comey, which gives motive. And then what was today's?
I know we've been on the set for 20 minutes.
Could we check and get back?
So one of the things that the White House has pushed back.
Oh, using the intelligence agencies.
That's right. That's right.
So you had the smoking gun today too.
Yeah. So with the White House, pushed back on the Russia investigation is that the issue's not Russia, it's leaks and leaking.
Yeah.
This administration does seem to leak pretty, I don't want to say like a sieve,
yeah.
but they leak pretty well. What's going on there?
I'm going to tell you one more. Before I get to that, I'm going to tell you one more story from Watergate. So Richard Nixon goes to court, gets a federal order to stop the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers, which was the biggest and most famous leak of all, right?
Yeah, yep.
And then the tapes record him 2 days later saying, hey, all that stuff that's really critical of JFK? Let's leak it to somebody. From the Pentagon Papers. So he wanted to leak the stuff that at that time, and with absolutely no sense of irony, as far as I can tell from listening to the tape, he said, the people have a right to know.
Another parallel.
Yeah, another parallel.
It's really, but leaks are important.
Yeah, leaks are important.
I mean, if you look at the history of the press, leaks have from inside reliable sources have actually brought out a lot of truth that otherwise would not ever have come to light.
Right.
You certainly have seen this in your career.
And I may be wrong about this, but in my memory, I cannot remember a leak that ever did serious damage to the country. That in the long run, in the short run, it might have been inconvenient. In the short run, it might have created a lot of work for maybe somebody at the Defense Department or the CIA.
Okay, so at the risk of revealing sources and methods,
yes.
as it would, so the public hears about leaks and leaking and how does it work? I worked in Washington for almost 20 years. I'm not really sure how leaks work. So as someone who maybe has received a leak or two, how does that typically work?
Well, there's two ways. One is that the administration wants to do a trial balloon, and they call in a reporter and they say, the president is considering this, and that is leaked. And that's not the kind of leak that the White House is complaining about now. What the kind of leak that the White House is complaining about now is executive branch officials who are either upset about what's going on, want to cover their bets and continue to maintain friendships in the press, or are holdovers from the Obama administration and are doing this out of political spite. It's always been go to the guy that has the axe to grind. And for various reasons, some people do it just because they like being in the center of attention and having reporters come to them all the time.
Look, there's a certain buzz to that and a certain high to doing that. I also think there are people who leak, and I think Ellsberg would certainly fit this category, who are true patriots, who are doing this for the common good because they sense and see and can confirm by their leaking a real danger to the republic.
Yeah.
And those are people I admire. So that leads us to a question. Is there a quote unquote deep throat, do you think, somewhere in Washington right now? Somebody who's got quote unquote all the goods?
My looking from the outside in is that I think that at the top echelon of the FBI and in the other intelligence agencies, the people who really know what Russia was doing, how serious it was, and it's a big deal. This is a foreign country coming in and messing with our election. I mean, it gets me angry just as a citizen at the Russians. But they saw what was going on, and then they see Trump coming in and applying pressure on them to back off. And this offends their sense of integrity. It offends them as bureaucrats protecting their turf. They don't want to be dominated by, some of them may be saying, well, you know what, if we have a president of the United States who has the power to run roughshod over the FBI and influence all the decisions we make every day about criminality and where we look and what our methods are, you're really taking the first step towards tyranny. And so there's lots of reasons for the intelligence officials and the FBI at the highest level, and the Justice Department at the highest level, to say, this is something we haven't seen before.
Look, realistically sensing a fear of tyranny, whether in fact that is a possibility, I think that's patriotic. If you sense that as a possibility, if you're a patriot, I think you would want to do something to prevent that from happening.
Yeah,
and again, I'm not saying that would or will happen.
These are human beings.
Yeah.
They're cops. Cops bend the rules to get convictions all the time. So they're not like pure as the driven snow, but they have a basic integrity about how the process works, and the process is not supposed to be used for politics.
So as someone who's spent time in the Washington press corps, how did you react to the assertion earlier this year that the press is the enemy of the American people?
Again, it's a Nixon analogy. I'm sorry, but there's this great tape in the middle of the Christmas bombing of 1972 when he's unleashed the B-52s on Hanoi, and he's sitting there talking with Henry Kissinger, and all of a sudden he says, "The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. Write that on the blackboard 100 times." Henry, the press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. And what Trump added, which even Nixon never went that far, was enemy of the people. It's funny to me because he's a Republican president, has a Republican House, has a Republican Senate, and now has a Republican Supreme Court and 36 Republican state houses, and yet it seems to me all they can do, meaning the White House and the administration upper-ups, is to complain about leaks in the press. I mean, come on. I mean, and you've got your own television network, and at least one with Fox News.
This is a fascinating conversation, and it's a remarkable book, but unfortunately we're out of time. We need to leave it here. John Farrell, the book is Richard Nixon, The Life. If you enjoyed this episode, you can learn more about Story in the Public Square by following us on Facebook and Twitter, or visiting pellcenter.org. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis. We hope we'll see you again next week for another edition of Story in the Public Square.